It started as a whisper in Detroit, a hushed chat behind factory doors, before erupting like a shockwave over America's industrial heart. Ford Motor Company, the emblem of American steel, sweat and scale, had recently suffered an unexpected setback. Factories were shuttered, workers were sent home, production lines were halted, and tariffs were imposed by Washington, not a foreign force. Before we proceed, please click the like button to help us defeat the YouTube algorithm and show your support. On May 17th, Ford surprised the nation by announcing the closure of many of its most famous US production plants. The Chicago facility, where hundreds of Ford Explorers and Lincoln Aviators were formerly produced, became quiet. The Michigan assembly, home of the Broncos and Rangers, suspended movement, and hundreds of workers were advised to go home and wait for a call. No one knows when it will come. The reason is tariffs, not the sort that protects, but the kind that punishes. The kind that promised to bring jobs back, but instead sent them tumbling. President Donald Trump's trade agenda has finally hit the assembly line. A broad 25% tax on all imported components and automobiles, intended to penalize China and Mexico, ended up hurting America's own manufacturing. Ford indicated that it would face an earnings impact of more than $1,500 million in 2025, a financial shock that no firm, even Ford, could withstand. And so the shutdown started. It didn't stop with Ford. Across the Midwest, ripple effects erupted. General Motors hurried to retool its manufacturing lines, laying off hundreds and covertly transferring some truck assembly back to Indiana. Stellantis, the parent company of Chrysler and Dodge, has idled whole operations in Canada and Mexico. But the suffering spread to Michigan and Indiana, where 900 workers at component manufacturers were laid off overnight. Ford attempted to hold the line. It implemented emergency price modifications. The Mustang Mach-E, Maverick, and Bronco Sport, all built in Mexico, had their prices increased by roughly $2,000 to compensate for the taxes. For customers, the shock came quickly. For dealerships, it hit hard. Even yet, Ford felt it was insufficient. Behind the scenes, officials cautioned that further cuts might be forthcoming. Tariffs have raised prices on everything from steel to gadgets. The Lincoln Nautilus, imported from China, had become too expensive to compete in showrooms. Ford ceased all shipments to China, losing access to one of the world's major vehicle markets. The message was plain. The trade war was no longer a theory, it was policy. And it stung. How will Trump respond? He didn't flinch. When reporters questioned Ford about the production stoppage, he said it was expected. Then he doubled down. They should have resumed manufacturing a long time ago, he remarked. These tariffs prioritize America. The comment sent shivers down every boardroom in the automotive sector. If the president could ignore Ford's fall, who was next? There were caution signals everywhere. Stellantis suspended SUV manufacturing in Mexico for a whole month. Parts have stopped pouring. The assembly stopped moving. Employees went quiet. The layoffs then spread to 5 stamping sites in the United States that use the identical models. Morale has disappeared. Executives avoided cameras. And, for the first time in years, the union openly criticized the firm. It was no longer about pressure. It was about surviving. At GM's Fort Wayne truck plant, where Silverado and Sierra trucks are made, the business attempted to take a stance. They added a shift. They employed 200 employees. They reactivated a factory that had been idle for retooling. The idea is to build more vehicles on US territory to avoid tariffs. For the time being, everything seemed to work. However, beneath that short-term victory came a long-term warning. If supply networks do not change, even the most faithful plants may fail. Nissan has begun cancelling US orders for some SUVs manufactured in Mexico. Toyota paused its delivery. Honda increased pricing. The storm was not passing, it was strengthening. Then came the customers. In April, new automobile costs increased by more than 2.5% in a single month, rather than just a few dollars. It was the greatest increase in years. Dealerships cautioned that customers were racing to sign contracts before the next price increase. But inventory was depleting, deliveries were lagging, and the models that had previously dotted the lots were disappearing. Ford struggled to stay up. It extended employee pricing to everyone, a measure often reserved for extreme situations. The objective was straightforward: keep sales going even as expenditures rose. However, the gamble merely purchased time. The mathematics no longer worked. At every stage, the supply chain failed. Auto parts manufactured in Mexico were now 25% more costly. Vehicles built in Canada were taxed at the border. China-made components, ranging from batteries to semiconductors, faced charges of up to 30%. And the firms that relied on them were being pushed to the brink. Ford CEO Jim Farley described the new reality as the fairest fight in decades. He intended it as optimism. However, behind the scenes, Ford was modifying its estimates, reducing guidance, and attempting to explain to shareholders how a business that manufactures roughly 4 out of every 5 of its vehicles in America was still losing money. Then came the layoffs. Workers in areas such as Kokomo and Toledo, who had been spared during the previous recession, were now struck. Component lines were shut down, whole hours were eliminated, and the communities that rely on those salaries, including eateries, grocery stores, and repair shops, began to feel the effects. Governors in several states convened emergency meetings. Indiana's labor boards issued concerns about growing unemployment. Michigan's mayors urged Washington for assistance. However, tariffs remained in place. Wall Street watched in bewilderment. Auto stocks fell, supplier shares plummeted, and experts warned that if tariffs were maintained, the industry may lose more than 1 million sales this year alone. What was the message from Washington? There are no modifications. Trump's administration promised that the hardship was only temporary, that businesses would return, and that manufacturing would reopen. However, no one in the sector was waiting for aid. Ford began to ponder future product launches. GM moved engineers, Stellantis halted hiring, and in the background, a whisper swelled into a shout. Is this what America initially looked like? Because what is currently being lost is not only money, but also momentum. The North American auto industry was once a wonder, a finely linked machine that covered 3 nations, thousands of suppliers, and tens of millions of automobiles. Now that the system is disintegrating, Ford and GM cannot just relocate all production to the United States overnight. Their supply chains were developed over several decades and optimized for cost and speed. Breaking them apart is not only costly, but also dangerous. Nonetheless, tariffs force this. For every job created in Indiana, another is lost in Michigan. For every shift added in Fort Wayne, another is stopped in Windsor. It is a shell game, and the pieces are running low. The political rift is widening. Trump feels the struggle is worthwhile. Democrats argue that the expense is too great. Workers are trapped in the middle, watching their incomes dwindle and their prospects fade. So what happens next? The industry is preparing for reprisal. China has already put taxes on American automobiles. Exports are drying up. Overseas markets are leaning towards Korean and European models. American automobiles are getting prohibitively pricey elsewhere. And soon, maybe at home. And Ford? It's not gone. Not yet. However, for the first time in decades, it is reeling. And the people who established this firm, who dedicated decades to it and reared their families on the earnings it provided, are asking the question no one wants to answer. Was it worthwhile?